Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Science of Kabbalah with your hosts, Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
The Science of Kabbalah presents the beginnings of all beginnings, William Hall.
Good day, sir. Bereshit week.
Bereshit week, the beginning of the beginning of the beginnings,
Nice.
Of the end.
Yes, indeed.
So,
I almost said it's good to see you.
it is good to be seen. That's what I usually say to people when they say that. Well, it's good to hear you, too.
Yeah, thank you.
Did you have a good holiday season?
Yes, I did. I spent a lot more time out of the studio than I would have liked, but that's okay. I did enjoy the holidays, for sure.
So, meaningful, is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir.
Good. Meaningful is good. And how are we going to put all of this together this week? I mean, I get so excited because of Bereshit. There's so much you can talk about from a Kabbalistic perspective, but then there's also talking about things that we've been talking about for months, about lockdowns and different things that are going on around the world. We had some interesting things here happen. You know, I talk often about the fact that I live just above the ancient cemetery in Sfat where the Ari HaKadosh is buried, and the Ramak is buried, some of the great tzaddikim, the great Kabbalists of the past, people that we talk about all the time, these great tzaddikim and the things that they wrote. And we had fires all this week. There was a fire just below my street, above the cemetery.
Wow. I saw the pictures, you and your wife, and even a video, I think.
And then there was another fire again below the cemetery. So there's one above and there was one below. And I have to say that I always wonder what's going on when that happens. Because fire is a significant sign, even within Kabbalah. We always talk about the concept of fire and water related to Torah, Eish, and Mayim. And so there's always things that are spinning around in my head when I start to see these things. Are they signs of what's going on in the world? Are the tzaddikim upset with us for some reason with things that are going on with the attitude of people? So I think I definitely want to focus on Bereshit. I want to focus on some of the things I learned over the holiday and some of the things that I've been thinking about. So I think it's going to be interesting. Hopefully we're going to be able to tie some of these things together about Parshat Bereshit. So you're not going to want to miss this show. Stick with us. We're going to be right back after a short break here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Always challenging the status quo. Hello, I'm Rod Bryant on Beyond the Matrix here at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I want to encourage you to listen each week, every Wednesday at the same time, for an amazing show that will challenge you, inform you, and inspire. News, views, and wisdom for the nations here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Don't forget, Beyond the Matrix every week, Wednesday, here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
All right, welcome back to Israel News Talk Radio, Science of Kabbalah, episode 4,800,212. Anyway, Rabbi, so good to be back in here with you.
What's the gematria? What is that gematria? 4,800,000.
Man, that may actually be Hashem's real name. Who knows?
There you go.
Wow. I actually did hear something one time on that regard, that the name of Hashem, his actual name, not the Tetragrammaton, but his actual name consists of every letter in the alphabet. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's in Kabbalah or if that's just somebody had a wild idea or not, but that would be kind of interesting for sure. Rabbi, I don't know how things were for you guys. I mean, during the holy days, it was very, very awesome here. You just touched base on it a little bit in the introduction because you're mentioning about the fires and I guess you could say the power that be, not powers, but the power that be. You know, what's is Hashem pleased, or whatever the case may be. But every time something awkward happens around here, I tend to tie that to something spiritually in my own journey, and it just seems to consistently fall that way, like every time, which is probably why I believe it so much. But this year was really neat. It was unique in that I had a different epiphany, I guess you could say.
Okay.
And it was one of those things where I think you and I discussed on the last show, possibly, but we have that series for me when I need something changed in my life. It's easier for me to change like 2 or 3 things rather than just trying to change one. Because when I change one, it's like, yeah, you kind of in and out. But if you say, no, I've got a lot of stuff to fix, and you work on all of these things, and then all of a sudden, these things are interconnected with each other because of your daily routine. And if you're dedicated more to 2 than you are the third one, but since they're connected, you don't want to fail any of them. So it's almost like more of a motivation to really push harder to make sure those goals get met. And so that kind of happened this year, for Yom Kippur, and it was just really nice. It was a very personal time this year. Not that it isn't every year, but it just seemed more so this year.
Well, I think has been very significant for a lot of people. It's just surprising to hear different people's perspective on it, because I find that there doesn't seem to be as much of a gray zone this year with most people. What I find in talking to different people is people were either totally disconnected from the holidays this year because of, here in Israel, we have the lockdown, or people really pressed in and felt like they had a much more significant, a much more profound experience in their prayer time, in their connection with Hashem, so forth. Personally, I had one of those experiences. I felt that not being around other people, being forced to be by myself, and in many ways, I have to say, whatever people's opinion is one way or the other, I look at it from every different angle. That's what I try to do. When you learn Torah, you find that one of the things in studying, like the oral Torah, for instance, is that we find that when you talk about the disagreements, or what we call the machloket, the arguments of the different rabbis, is not really arguments the way we know arguments today. It's really just them looking at sort of every facet of a diamond, looking at the law, the halakha, from every different perspective. So that's what I try to do. So when I say this is just one perspective. One of the things I was saying to my wife the other day is that sometimes I look at this. I don't know if this happened to you when you were a child, but I know that sometimes, my parents would get to the point where if I just get overly excited, they would just say, you know what, just go stand in the corner and face the wall. Don't talk, don't speak, don't turn around, don't talk to your sister. Just stand in the corner and face the wall. And sometimes I feel like this is exactly what Hashem is doing to us right now, at least here in Israel, with this idea of having a lock. But I'm not saying it in a bad way. I'm almost saying it in a good way, that because what I find is that I feel like so many people are distracted, and I've said this many times over the last several months, that I feel like people are losing focus. And the more they get distracted and the more they lose focus, the more stringent and it seems more restrictive things get. Like there's more constrictions and there's more restrictions that are taking place, and people are either going to recognize it and wake up and say, okay, I need to press in, I need to get closer to Hashem, or they're getting farther out there and just losing total focus and getting totally distracted with all this nonsense and all the conspiracy theories and
all of the above.
So anyway, one of the things that was really significant for us was we started studying one particular Torah from Rabbi Nachman in Likutei Maharan. Likutei Maharan, the first section, Memchet, it's Torah 48, and it starts off talking about one of the nikudot, one of the tzere, the tzere being one of the vowels, the 2 dots under a letter in Hebrew, which gives you the A sound, basically, tzere. And one of the things that he starts off with is a verse that's talking about how Moshe Rabbeinu basically struck the rock instead of speaking the rock, and as a result broke faith between Hashem and the Jewish people at that point. And then it goes into the concept of tzeh, and then uses the word vayitzer, which we see in the book of Bereshit. You and I have talked about that vayitzer with the double yud, where vayitzer, this idea of being formed, uses two yuds when it's talking about the creation of man, human beings, as opposed to animals. When it talks about animals being formed, it used vayitzer with one yud. And we know why. We say, why is that? Because we know that we have a neshama, but we also have a yetzer hara and a yetzer tov. We have the two inclinations, the good inclination and the evil inclination, which animals don't have. I mean, you might say animals behave badly, but animals just follow their nature, the way they were created to be. They don't have what we have. They don't have they have a nefesh, but they don't have a neshama, and they don't have a good inclination or an evil inclination like we do. And that's the difference between those two in Bereshit. And so what we find is that, I bring that up, this idea of vowels and the idea of letters and talking about Bereshit. So one of the biggest questions that always comes up when we come to the book of Bereshit, and it's brought up by Rabbi Chaim Vital, who was the main student of the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria Ashkenazi, the Ari HaKadosh, asks the question, why is it that we see at the very beginning of the Torah, at the very beginning of the Bible, the first book, Bereshit, Genesis, why does it start Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz? Why does the first word of the Torah start with the second letter of the Aleph Bet or the Hebrew alphabet? Why doesn't it start with an Aleph? It's a question, the $64,000 question. Why did the Torah start like that? And yet, we know that an Aleph was used for the first letter of the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 sayings, or what we call the 10 Commandments, because it started with Anochi. So I want to thank my good friend Rabbi Avram Sutton for part of this, because I used some of his notes for this this amazing lesson. So the Midrash gives us sort of an answer, because it asks the same questions, and then it offers a few answers to this. And one of them is from Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi, who expounded on this concept of the works of creation, which we call Maaseh Bereshit. He says, why was the world created with a bet? To inform you that there are two worlds, this world and the world to come. So we have the Olam Hazeh, this world, and the Olam Haba, the world to come. So isn't it interesting that we're always talking about these twos? You know, we're talking about in Kabbalah, the tension that exists between two sides, between the right side and the left side, between chesed and gevurah, for instance, between loving kindness and judgment. We just talked about vayitzer, this idea that the word formed has two yuds instead of the one yud. And here we're asking the question, why does Bereshit start out with Bereshit bara Elokim, with the second letter of the Aleph Bet? And we have the first answer giving us kind of a similar answer to the other things we've been saying already, which is why, because Hebrew letters also are related to numbers. So Bet would be the second letter and also be related to the number 2. And the first answer we get is to inform us that there are two worlds. There is this world, what we call the Olam Hazeh, and the world to come, which is the Olam Haba, which all of us obviously are waiting to see soon Mashiach come to bring us into the world to come. But that is a completely different show. And we may have to talk about that a little bit, because I also say quite often that I think people need to be careful about this idea of constantly crying out for Geulah, constantly crying out for redemption, and constantly crying out for Mashiach. I think we should be, according to the tenets of Judaism, be waiting every day for Mashiach. There's no question. But this concept of constantly crying out for Geulah we know that we want redemption, but we want redemption to come sweetly. And this ties in with what you said, William, with this idea of working on ourselves and working on all of our different issues so that we don't just get a redemption that we don't want. Because Hashem can bring redemption, but it doesn't necessarily have to come sweetly. And I think that what we're seeing today is, one could say that people have been crying out for redemption, and we're sort of seeing a redemption that's not exactly sweet right now. We're going to have to go to a break, but when we come back, we can talk a little bit more about this, a little bit more about why the book of Bereshit started the way it did, and see where we go from there. So stay with us. We're going to be right back after a short break here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Science of Kabbalah here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. I introduced you. This is Rabbi Yitzchak, for those that might be here for the first time, along with
Sean Connery. Just kidding.
Sean Connery, the amazing William Hall.
Oh, I'm glad you take
better than Sean Connery. Well, I'm sure your wife and kids think you're amazing sometimes.
Yeah, they're kind of partial, though.
Yeah. And probably your mother likes you, too.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So anyway, before the break, we were talking about these, not so much dualities, but kind of twos that we see often in Kabbalah. And we were asking the question why the beginning of the Bible, Bereshit, the book of Genesis, starts with the letter Bet, Bereshit, Bara Elokim. And we gave one answer that Rabbi Yehuda Ben Pazi, along with Bar Kapara, asked the question, why was the world created with a bet? And it says because of the Olam Haba and the Olam Hazeh, this, the world to come and this world. And then they ask, and then there's another answer that comes up. It says because the first letter of Beracha, which is the word for blessing, is a bet. And then it says, why not with an Aleph? And it says because Aleph is the first letter of the word Arira, which is the word for curse. And then it's asks again, why with the letter Bet? And then it says, it gives us another two. It says, for the letter Bet has two spikes, one above and one below. And it says, if the Bet was asked, if you asked the Bet the question, who created you? It says it shall move its upper spike and say, he who is above created me. If asked, what is his name? It shall move its lower spike and say, Yud Kei Vav Kei is his name. And then said Rabbi Elazar ben Chanina, in the name of Rab Acha, the Aleph stood before the throne of the Holy One, blessed be he, and for 26 generations it complained, saying, Master of the world, I am the first letter, and yet you didn't create your world with me. And the Holy One, blessed be he, replied, the world and all it contains exists only in the merit of the Torah. In the future, I'm going to give the Torah on Har Sinai, and I promise you that I will not begin any other letter than with you, as it says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am the eternal, your God, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2. So we see that although he started Bereshit, that's why we said at the very beginning that it's brought that the Aleph was used in the Aseret HaDibrot, in the 10 sayings or the 10 commandments. We could also talk about the gematria, because the numerical value of the aleph is 1, while the gematria of the bet is 2. And we know if the creation is meant to sort of manifest and reveal Hashem's oneness, God's oneness, why doesn't the creation narrative begin with the aleph? Because we know everything is about the oneness of Hashem. Why would we have this concept of waiting until standing at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, to hear Hashem speak and to bring those 10 words that Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God? So, of course, the first answer was that there are 2 worlds, where we said, or 2 different time periods for creation. And we could say that sort of in this world, Hashem's oneness sort of has to be hidden. And only in the world to come is Hashem's oneness really going to be revealed. In other words, from a Kabbalistic perspective, there's no way of knowing really Hashem. When you start talking about, from Kabbalah, for instance, we talk about the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, and we talk about Keter, Keter being the crown. Keter exists at a level where it's ineffable. It's unknowable. We can't know the level of Keter. There's just no conception there. It's not until we come into the level of Chokhmah, below that, which is the word for wisdom, where Chokhmah, we start to see a little bit of an opening up. And Chokhmah is related to an idea. For instance, let's say you have in your mind that you want to build a house. So it's at Chokhmah, the level of Chokhmah, where you sort of have this idea, okay, I want to build a house. But for really the opening up, for something to be really revealed, you have to move into the level of Bina, which is also under Keter. You have Keter, Chokhmah, Bina. Bina is understanding. So Chokhmah is the idea. You have the idea that you want to build a house. But what's the house going to look like? How big is the house going to be? How many rooms are going to be it? How many doors? How many windows? Where's the kitchen going to be? All of that relates to now setting something down on a blueprint. And that's the conceptualization of the idea. So you have Keter, where we don't know anything. You have Chokhmah, where we get a flash of light, which is the idea. And then we come into Binah, which is the conceptualization of the idea. That would be where we start to see the real opening up of understanding. And so, in context of what we're talking about, then we understand that bet, that letter bet, which the Genesis starts with, embodies an initial state of two-ness rather than oneness. And that's where we talk about that tension or the dichotomy in which man is given the choice to either participate in the revelation of Hashem's oneness or to deny it and fight against it. That's really what we're talking about here. And this can go really into the whole idea of not only accepting the oneness of Hashem, his oneness, like when we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, the idea that Hashem is one, but it goes even further into the oneness of the Torah, in the idea that when you're talking about the twos and talking about the written Torah and the oral Torah, and the idea that those can't be separated either, that you could sort of see it as two-ness, but the oneness of Hashem also relates to the oneness of the Torah, that those two can't be denied as well. And so that when you're talking about participating in the revelation of Hashem's oneness or denying it and fighting against it, you can do the same thing by denying and fighting against the oral Torah. So the letter bet at the beginning of the Torah clues us to the overriding reason for which Hashem would conceal his ultimate purpose and bring a world into existence that seemingly contradicts the oneness, based on the idea that he started with the letter bet instead of the letter aleph. But really, when you're talking about a revelation of the unified light of Hashem and this idea of concealment and this idea of really connecting with Hashem and sort of bringing a revelation of his oneness and so forth, this idea which has to do with the perfection of the world also, I mean, when you think about this, we're talking about awesome and cosmic proportions, the things that we're talking about. So now if you look at what the Ari answers to this question of why the Torah begins with the letter Bet, based on a number of really simple things that he said, which he gave over to Rabbi Chaim Vital, again, remembering that a lot of what the Ari brought, he brought to, in the same way that we talk about Rabbi Nachman and Rab Natan, his main student, who really was the one who put down on paper Likutei Moharan. Rav Chaim Vital was the same thing to the Ari, but much earlier. We're talking about in the 15 and 1600s here in Tzfat. So basically, what the Ari teaches is that the Torah has really, or contains, two aspects. It has the Peshat, which we know is the simple or literal meaning, and then it has the Sod, which we call the secret or the much deeper meaning. And the Peshat of the Torah can be called its body, while the Sod of the Torah can be called its soul. And the body corresponds to what? The Olam Hazeh, this world, while its soul corresponds to the Olam Haba, the world to come. So there we're making that connection back to something that we said earlier as well. And so the important thing to know is that when we're talking about the complete revelation of the soul level of the Torah, that really that is reserved for the world to come. Like we said, that's not going to come until we get to the Olam Haba. But it doesn't mean that just because we have to wait for the Olam Haba to have the full revelation of what that means of the soul level of the Torah, which is the deep understanding, it doesn't mean that we don't have sort of little drops of revelation that come to us now, where we get these drops or inklings of the deeper levels of Torah that are available to us even now. And this is exactly the kind of things that we learn and we look to, for instance, to the Ari, to the writings of the Ari, or to the writings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is the author of the Zohar. Two very significant, the two most significant people probably in my life when you're talking about these things. And when you look to, one of the greatest rabbis of the modern era, Rabbi Shlomo Eliashiv, who was one of the great Kabbalists of the 20th century, he said this. He said, the light was hidden until the future, but in rare instances, a flashing illumination of its brilliance is revealed when souls like those of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Ari HaKadosh, and others like the Baal Shem Tov, the Alter Rebbe, the Or HaChaim, the Ramchal, the Vilna Gaon, the Rashash, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, etc. have appeared. So that's why we look to these great tzaddikim all the time to get greater understanding. So once again, we're going to have to go to a break, William, but when we come back in a final segment, I don't know that we're going to get anywhere near where we want to be.
We never do. That's okay.
We
That's
never
a good
do.
teaching.
But we're going to try. So stick with us. We'll be right back here on The Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Ben-Tekoa, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah. This is our final segment, unfortunately. You know, the whole concept that you're discussing right now, still part of me still kind of struggles to wrap my head around it. But whenever I get to that state of mind, I try to remind myself back whenever, no one even knew what microwaves were or what the really deeper parts of science that we can't see with our eyes, neurons and protons, electrons. It's like just because we can't see them doesn't mean it's not there, doesn't mean they don't exist, right? Mm-hmm. Even the whole idea of quarks, the scientists have found out that on the smallest level, on the greatest ability to zoom under whatever microscope that they have, they found these little vibrating things they call quarks, inside a rock. I mean, it's like that. It doesn't make sense. It's a solid item, but you've got this stuff going on in there on a way deeper level. So, no one could really, how would I say this? No one could argue this intelligibly at all. That's why I tend to believe it more so, seeing all these other things. So I'm like, that's enticing to say the least. So
look,
carry on.
Yeah. I mean, look, sometimes people will think of this as like scholastic gymnastics or whatever, thinking it's way too difficult to understand. And sometimes I get there as well, and I look at these things, but then I start studying something and I look at something else, like the Torah I was talking about, Rabbi Nachman, and anybody can look that up. I mean, there are English versions in Rabbi Nachman, Lukatei Maharan, Torah 48, which is very deep. And the more you learn these things, the more you start to see connections with things that you already see and things that you already know. When you start talking about creation, when you start talking about the deeper things, you just talked about quarks. So, for instance, I wrote about this some time ago, the idea of, and of course, the whole theme and the whole idea of Science of Kabbalah came about. First of all, I believe Kabbalah is a science, which is one of the main reasons why we call the show Science of Kabbalah. But I also, early on, really tried to tie these things together. When you talk about the Big Bang Theory, I can't emphasize this enough. I say this a lot on the show, but I think people need to understand how important it is what I'm saying. That prior to the early 1970s, scientists believed that the universe was basically eternal. It wasn't until the early 1970s. Wrap your head around that. It wasn't until the early 1970s that the Big Bang Theory came into existence, meaning that like up until 1972, modern science believed that the universe was eternal, and then suddenly the concept of the Big Bang Theory came in the 1970s to say that the universe actually had a beginning. If you want to take it further, when you start studying modern day physics, and I'm not saying I understand anything about it, I used to love watching that show, The Big Bang Theory, where Sheldon would start talking about string theory and all these different things. Now, I don't understand those things, but when I try to learn a little bit about it, you'll find it's crazy that when you start talking about string theory and then even M theory, which is a new theory that's kind of expanded off of the concept of string theory, they start talking about a 10-dimensional universe. Well, 10 dimensions, isn't that interesting when you start talking about the Eitz Chaim and the 10 Sfirot? And then M theory takes it one step further, William, and says, well, no, there's an 11th dimension. Well, isn't that interesting? Because in the 10 Sfirot, there's actually a quasi-sphira, which is Da'at, which is in between Chokhmah and Binah, which means knowledge. So you have Chokhmah, which is wisdom, you have knowledge, Da'at, and then Binah. So you have this quasi sort of 11th dimension, on that tree of life, an 11th Sphira. when you look at the writings, for instance, of the Ramban, Nachmanides, and you look at, he was writing things 1,000 years ago that modern science is just coming up with theories to discuss now. So I can't discount those things. While I understand, I always have this kind of saying in the back of my head, show me a man who doesn't doubt his faith and I'll show you an unbeliever. I think all of us at almost some point in our lives sit down and say, okay, wait a minute. Now this is taking things a little bit too far. How do I believe things like this? And all I'm doing is I'm throwing things out there into the mix. And I'm saying, you know what? Eat the meat and throw the bones away. I'm not telling you that you have to accept everything that I'm saying. I'm just throwing out some of the teachings of these amazing sages and saying it's worth looking at. And if these deeper understandings, if these deeper revelations, when you start looking at the Kabbalah, open up a new world to you and give you a better understanding of the Torah that you're learning, then Baruch Hashem, amazing.
Right.
And if it doesn't, it doesn't. It's okay. It's not for everybody. I'm not saying it is. So when we get back to looking at this idea of the revelation that comes through things like the Holy Zohar and the teachings of the Ari related to this aspect of the Torah, that of course the Holy One, we know that the Holy One took delight in the Torah. One of the things that we learn in Judaism that the sages teach is that at midnight Hashem goes into Gan Eden, even now, and learns with the tzaddikim, with the righteous souls. And obviously there's a level that they learn at that's not for us. We don't have that revelation. It would be wonderful, but that only comes at the Olam Haba. So therefore, the fact that the Torah begins with the letter Bet of the word Bereshit, the Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning Hashem created, also comes to teach us that the Torah is the second Torah, the one that took on the lower form of this world and which sort of serves as a garment for the initial Torah. So remember, we were talking about a body and a soul. You're talking about these two levels of the Torah. So again, it's for this reason that the Torah begins with a Bet, which is, again, the second letter of the Aleph Bet. And then our sages also taught in the Gemara in Chagiga 11b that we do not have permission to speak about what preceded Aleph, for this bears on questions such as what preceded this world, which, in other words, what's above and what's below. Again, it goes back to this idea that when you start looking at the different worlds, like the dimension of Atzilut, the upper world, when we're talking about the level of Keter, the world of Atzilut, which is considered the first world in that it preceded Bria, the second world. This goes back and teaches us that the Torah that we have comes from Bria. It therefore uses the word bara, created, because Bria is the world of creation, the world of creation or formation. So all of these things connect. The names, and when you start looking at names, again, words and names and letters are all significant in Hebrew. So the names given to these two levels or dimensions, they're not some arbitrary names that people came up with. So that when you look at Atzilut, that world that we're talking about, to kind of give you and everybody else that's listening a better understanding, Atzilut comes from the verb root lahatzil, meaning to emanate, like the noun etzel, meaning near or approximate. So you have this world of emanation that is associated with the highest dimension, which begins with the letter Aleph, whereas the second world below it, Bria, that's associated with the second highest dimension, begins with the letter Bet. So this is as opposed to Atzilut, and all the more so because there we only contemplate the idea of thought. Bria corresponds to what's called Hirhur, this kind of oscillating thought, the intermediate stage that takes place as we translate pure thought into words. So in other words, again, I said Atzilut is a place that we can't understand. Keter is at that level. We don't have any understanding. We don't have any conceptualization. We don't even have flashes of light at that. That's the level of Atzilut, machshava, thought and silent contemplation, if you will. It's only when you get into the level of Beriah, below that, the level of formation, of creation, that world is where we then have the ability to sort of start translating this pure thought into words. And then we come into Yetzirah, Yetzirah being formation, like we just said, Vayitzer, the two yuds of Vayitzer, which comes from to form. We have Yetzirah, which is the world of formation. That corresponds to speech. And then Asiyah, the lowest world, which is the world we live at, the world of Malchut, corresponds to Ma'aseh, the idea of doing. So you have all these different levels, and all of them mean something, and all of them are significant. We have a sort of running out of time, so I'm going to end with this verse. There's a verse in Eov in the book of Job, and it says, "A pouch of wisdom is better than rubies. Pure gold cannot be weighed against it." But where does wisdom come? From where does it come? Where is the source of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all beings, concealed from the foul or angelic beings of the heavens. God understands the way to it. He knows its source, for he sees to the ends of the earth. He observes all that is beneath the heavens. When he fixed the weight of the winds, set the measure of the waters, when he set an ordinance for the rain and a course for the thunder, he saw it and he declared it. He measured it, and yes, he examined it. See, the fear of Hashem is wisdom, to shun evil is understanding. From Job 28:18 to 28. So we may have to do a little bit more on this next week. I'm going to have to see, because there's so much more that we could say about this idea of why the letter Bet started, and this concept of thought and speech and deed and so forth. But as usual, William, we're out of time.
That's too bad. I'm sorry.
So, God willing, if we don't have a guest next week, maybe we'll pick this up and continue on this.
Okay, that sounds good. On good plan.
Thanks everybody for staying with us each week here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the Israel News Talk Radio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.